Columbia, as you all know, is building a new campus down in Manhattanville, and the first building that they built is a huge commitment to what they call mind, brain, and behavior, which is supposed to sort of find out how people actually operate. One of the endearing but also horrible things about 19th century thought was how many innovative thoughts were entertained on the basis of virtually no hard knowledge. And speculation, once it was repeated enough and acquired disciples, speculations of the most unlikely sort came to be thought by many people to be truths. And those that I'm interested in today are those that deal with one of the hardest topics for contemporary historians to deal with, and that is human inequality. Oddly enough, if you go back to historians of 200 years ago, in the early 19th century, they had very few problems with human inequality. It was manifest, and it didn't bother them very much. They might think that slavery was a bad idea for various reasons, but that did not mean that they ascribed equality to those people who were enslaved. Abraham Lincoln, for example, was strongly in favor of having the African American slave population repatriated to Africa. He did not think that they were assimilable in the United States because they were different. We now have pretty much a universal commitment in this country, though not worldwide, to the notion of equality. Although it is time and again an equality that has to be appraised with respect to some sort of norm. For example, should there be an equality of riches, or should there be an equality of opportunity, so that people are free to be poor or rich according to their opportunity? Should there be an equality of color or gender, or any number of things? And the issue of difference is now perhaps as vexing as any that we have, because there are incompatibilities between the assumption of equality and people's perception of the real world. If you go back to 1800, the real world trumped philosophy. People said there was inequality. And they often imputed to it a certain scientific substance. I have a book, for example, entitled Negromania. It's published around 1800. And what it is a collection of articles meant to show the stupidity of people who claimed that Africans were equal to white people. And they were from some of the most distinguished naturalists and philosophers and thinkers of the time, because everybody had some interest in the topic. And it was felt that the argument for equality was preposterous. It was a fanatic, fringe view that any right-thinking person observing the real world would repudiate. But when you look at the notions of inequality that you had in 1800, they're very different from the notions of inequality that you have in 1900. And it's that change that comes in this period of the late 19th century that this chapter on the new power balance is devoted to, that I want to talk about. and it is the change that we generally label as social Darwinism. In 1800, you had, in the scientific world, particularly of natural science, of observational science, you had a passion for classification. This goes back at least to the 17th century, in some respects to the 16th. And it was manifested in the desire to give every species of plant or animal a scientific name that would distinguish it from every other species, and to classify those species within families, within genera. So you had an individual animal. It would belong to a species. The species would belong to a genus. The genus would belong to an order, to a phylum, etc. And you had a great sort of tree-like structure of all being. Botanists, zoologists, entomologists were fascinated by classification. And some of the most famous scientists at the time were known for the collections they had and their identification of previously unknown plants and animals. This was something that, as I say, it's largely 16th century because it was the European travels in foreign parts, the New World and the parts of Asia that they reached by sailing around Africa, that stimulated them to create these classifications and to try and put everything into some sort of an order. Humans, of course, were then subjected to the same sort of classification. If you had humans who looked as different, say, as a rose looked from a tulip, it's dealing strictly on a visual basis, then how could one not classify the humans? You could classify them according to appearances, hair color or texture, skin color, shape of the skull, stature, abilities to do certain things, and seeming disabilities to do other things. And of course, in this classification, as in all of the others, you have an enormous amount of arbitrariness. And I think it's one of the things that have taken generations to iron out is the question of whether classifications of organisms are sound or whether they are simply notional. When Linnaeus, the Swedish botanist, from whom we have borrowed our practice of giving three-part names to species, Carl Linnaeus was interested particularly in classification of plants, and he wrote it in very highly sexualized terms, depending on the number of stamens that a plant had. So you'd have some plants that were sexually differentiated with a female plant and a male plant, like date trees. Others would have one pistil and one stamen. They're sort of monogamous. Then you had the bigamous plants that had two stamens. And finally you get up to sort of gangbang plants where you have a lot of staples. And in the 17th century, there were people who were concerned that young ladies in England should not study botany because it was a science that bordered on depravity. And this was largely because of Linnaeus's decision to classify things according to number of stamens and then to characterize the classifications. So the classifications were always, to some degree, suppositious or conjectural. And the same thing with humans. How many races were there? How many different types of people were there? How do you label them? How do you classify them? This kind of thinking, by the time you get to, say, to the middle of the 19th century, is beginning to sort of metastasize in very unfortunate ways. Because new currents of scientific thought, or what passed as scientific thought, come to be common. And those new currents seek to apply science to this classification of peoples, as opposed to applying simply description. In other words, you could have Linnaeus, who's looking at the number of staples of stamens, or someone else who's counting the number of ribs or something like that. That's sort of descriptive science. But what you got in the late 19th century sought to be more scientific by being more engaged with theory and with what were thought of perhaps as natural laws, or what were proposed as natural laws. The governing view in this later part of the century, incidentally, this period of scientizing difference applies in a number of fields. It isn't simply a matter of race. This is the period when you get the idea that gender preferences are scientific differences, that someone who is homosexual falls into this category, someone who is heterosexual that category, and then trying to explain this in scientific terms. Or the science of psychology, where you try to explain differences of mind according to some notion of scientific theory. This is when Freudian psychology takes its roots out of biology. And in all of these things, there's almost a dearth of what would now pass as science. So the key thing for the division of peoples, that particular aspect of late 19th century science, was the notion of evolution. Evolution associated with Charles Darwin. Although it was jointly the conjecture that we call natural selection was jointly arrived at, as I've mentioned before in this class, by Darwin and Wallace working independently. Social Darwinism is the term used for the idea that evolutionary theory, natural selection, applies to differences among social groups up to the level of races and down to the level of simply nationalities or localities, in the same way that it applies to plants or animals. Oddly enough, social Darwinism was not a term that was used in the late 19th century. In fact, the term rarely occurs. I think the first appearance, it is used once, I think around 1877, but it rarely occurs in any literature at all until 1944. And the person who put social Darwinism on the map was a member of the Columbia History Department, Richard Hofstadter. In 1944, he wrote a book called Social Darwinism in America. From that time on, a label was available to talk about things that were considered particularly pernicious and unscientific about late 19th century thought. So some people have said, well, did Hofstadter invent social Darwinism? Not really. The word actually does exist. But it was rarely used until Hofstadter did it. And he associated social Darwinism with one particular thinker, Herbert Spencer, philosopher who died in 1903, and who never used the word social Darwinism, nor was the word social Darwinism ever used for him until Hofstadter came along. Spencer thus becomes sort of one of the great goats of history. When you read let's say a typical world history textbook, let's say The Earth and the People and its Peoples, on the chapter on the new power balance, you'll find social Darwinism attached to the name of Herbert Spencer, who never actually, probably ever heard the term. Other textbooks, some of them use Herbert Spencer's name in particular, and others simply discuss social Darwinism as if it were a movement that was actually recognized, say in the sense that Darwinism was. Nobody denies that Darwinism was a buzzword and a very important and controversial one in the late 19th century, just that social Darwinism was not. Herbert Spencer was the best-selling philosopher perhaps in the history of England. His books are estimated to have sold over 1 million copies during his lifetime. He was not a professor. Indeed, he was not educated at Oxford or Cambridge. He was an autodidact who had done some learning at home. He had a smattering of Latin, but did not have the classical education that was normal for Englishmen who were in the upper crust. But he was sort of adopted into the intellectual circle of Thomas Huxley. Huxley, who of course is a member of a long-standing intellectual family. We have various other Huxleys coming down to recent times, and was a pillar of sort of Oxford, Cambridge intelligentsia. Huxley probably was the one who coined the word Darwinism, because when Darwin received the essay from Wallace that contained all of the theories of natural selection, he wrote to or spoke with Huxley and said, now I must give up my last 14 years of work because somebody beat me to it. And Huxley said, no, we will fix up a meeting, we will read your material, we will read Wallace's material, and people will see that you had these ideas first, even though you didn't publish them. And then Huxley proceeded to call the theory Darwinism, which was fine with Wallace, because as a autodidact, someone who didn't have these high credentials, he was happy simply to be included in that clique. And so was Spencer. By being a friend of Huxley's and being invited to club meetings and dinner parties, he met George Eliot, he met eminent figures of the time, and he was a person of eccentric and little educated background. And yet, his book sold like hotcakes. And he made his living writing his philosophy books. Now, it's interesting. You think now, could somebody really become a celebrity as a philosopher with no particular educational background? And of course, the answer is yes, because we have the figure of Eric Hoffer, who wrote The True Believer, which became a very widely read book about fanaticism, and had no impressive educational credentials to write it. But when you have an example, a case of someone like Hoffer or Herbert Spencer, what you see is that there are people who find that particular philosophy instrumental in terms of their own agendas, which they hold as members of a more elite class than the particular individual. So Spencer was ballyhooed by an intelligentsia that he did not fully belong to, never married, had no children, did not create any succession. There was no Spencerian school of philosophy, but he was terribly successful, and he is thought to have originated the phrase survival of the fittest, which never occurs in Darwin's writings. The thing is, Spencer's views on human difference have almost nothing to do with Darwin or Darwin's theory of evolution. And social Darwinism has almost nothing to do with Darwin or with Darwin's theories of natural selection and evolution. Spencer was coming out of a very different tradition that goes back more to Thomas Malthus, who was the philosopher who wrote about the inevitable overpopulation of the earth and everyone dying of starvation, or to Auguste Comte, who was a positivist and said that, with leadership of scientific thought, everything will become better and better. Spencer preached the idea of progress, that everything was going to become better. And he used a notion of evolution, because the idea of evolution as a word, that is to say, the use of the word evolution for systematic change, predated Darwin. Natural selection was something that Darwin and Wallace came up with, but evolution was a word that was already there for, say, 2 generations or more before. In scientific terms, compared with Darwin, Spencer followed a late 18th century thinker named Lamarck. And Lamarckism is often contrasted with Darwinism. They're two...
Inherited.
Yeah. They are... Lamarck believed that, let's say, if you had a dog that you trained to be a great sheep herder, that the puppies that dog produced would be better sheep herders than the puppies produced by another dog that had never been exposed to sheep herding, because the skills that were acquired during the lifetime of the sheep herding dog would be transferred genetically to the puppies. Spencer applied this to humans. Said humans, as they know more, as they become better, as they gain greater control of the universe around them, they pass this on to their children in evolutionary terms. That is to say, the children are born smarter, more able. And this is the inheritance of acquired characteristics. One thing that's important to remember is that no one in the 19th century had the foggiest notion of what inheritance amounted to. It was not even known, for example, throughout, I think right up to the end of the 19th century, that mammals had eggs. I think the human ovum was identified in the early 20th century. The idea that there would be, that there had to be some sort of mechanism of inheritance was barely thought of. People didn't know about genes, obviously didn't know about DNA. They had no idea of what the mechanics of inheritance were. And they tended to simply go on an assumption that what you had in a parent animal would carry over into the offspring in not undiminished form, but in a form that you could predict. When you go into 18th century animal issues, and to some degree back into 17th century, you'll find that all of this is strongly associated with the idea of breeding. This is when scientific breeding, so-called, became a craze in certain areas, particularly among the British elite. People, for example, will go back now and look at how many breeds of dog were there in England in 1600. So they look at information on dogs and say, well, there appear to be maybe 6. And then you get to 1900 and you have like 125. You know, how did you go from having a very short list to having a very long list over 2 centuries in time? And of course the breeders could tell you, because they were selecting characteristics to be transferred genetically, although they had no idea what genetically meant, transferred by inheritance from the adult to the offspring. This was all conceived of within an economic framework, so that there would be financial advantage to creating or perfecting a breed or a variety. And there was a craze for particularly fat cows and fat pigs, where at fairs you would bring some humongously heavy cow or pig and exhibit it, and the weight would be published and it would be celebrated, and then it would be killed and butchered, and you would get to eat this really, really, really fatty meat. Because more fat was considered better, but the breeders knew that selecting for particular characteristics, like superabundant fat, was not consistent. That it might work for 2 or 3 generations. What they called in and in breeding was where you would have, let's say, a fat cow, and you would mate it with a fat bull, and then it would have calves. Then you would have the calf, the male calf would be bred with the mother, and the female with the father. And you would inbreed as much as possible in order to maximize the characters of the original parents. And in and inbreeding did produce, in the first generation or two, a significant number of really, really fat fat animals. But then defects began to show up, and people began to realize that that you had to have some breeding diversity, even though they had no idea what the mechanism was. Mendel and his theories of his experiments with pea plants showing the laws of inheritance was still a century, century and a half away. So sometimes you would get a clever breeder who would breed an extremely fat animal through in and in breeding for 2 or 3 generations, and then sell it to, Lord so-and-so as a bull for his livestock, realizing the next generation was going to be full of runts and phoebes, and that it wasn't going to pan out. Because the breeders knew a tremendous amount from their practical experiences. They knew it with large animals, at the level of horses and pigs and cows. They developed breeds of sheep for different qualities of wool and so forth. And eventually, they knew it for smaller animals, particularly chickens, canaries, ducks, dogs, cats, so forth and so on, pigeons, rats. Breeding became a fascinating hobby, and the people who actually superintended the breeding tended to be people from sort of working class backgrounds, but they were often patronized or their products were bought by the elite. They didn't keep records, except in particularly the cases of big animals like horses and cattle. So they could produce new strains of animals without anyone really having any record of how those strains came about. One of the most frequently queried examples is, where did laboratory rats come from? Sometime in the 19th century, scientists started to use albino rats in laboratory experiments because they didn't bite you, they were docile. You could, chop off their limbs or inject them with substances, do whatever you wanted. I mean, it was just a lab rat, but it was very different from a wild rat. Wild rat is a nasty animal that you don't want to handle, but the white rats were fine. And yet nobody knew where the white rats had come from. So you had different thoughts. One of them, and probably as close to being right, is that they derive from the practice of ratting, whereby you had rat collectors who would go out and collect 50 or 100 wild rats on the streets of London, put them in a gunny sack, take them to a pit where you would have someone's terrier, and then you would release 50 rats, and you would time how long it took the terrier to kill all of the rats, and you would bet on that. And ratting, competitive killing of rats, well, it was a craze for the sporting set back late 19th, late 18th, early 20th century, early 19th century. Now, among the rats they collected, there probably were some albino rats, because albinism is a characteristic that you find among rats and most other wild animals. There are some albinos that get born, just as there are among humans. But by and large, they don't live to reproduce. Because, here you are in a dangerous predatory environment, and you're saying, look, I am Snow White. And the nearest hawk or owl says, yeah, you sure are. You just stand out like a flag, you're lunch. And so the albinos would rarely survive, partly because they were white, and partly because albinos, by and large, appear to be extremely docile animals, which meant that they were not good for the ratting business. You know, you want a rat, you dump it out in the bag, the terrier there barking and yapping, and the rat goes, wee, 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 runs all over the, tries to get away, and then the terrier comes and breaks its neck, and everyone applauds. Where you don't want a rat that comes out of the bag and says, gee, look at all the people around. Is that a dog? It just isn't right. So it's thought that the white rats were kept aside by the breeders, or by the ratters, as pets, more or less. And then they found that when they bred the white rats with one another, they had a strain of white rats that they could sell, because they sold them for docility while they were selling the truly wild rats because of their excitability. So in both cases, you're at a commercial, in a commercial situation. Yet for all of the breeding that was done of all sorts of animals, no one ever produced something that was called a species. It's very difficult to define a species, even down to the present day. You cannot define it according to whether you have interbreeding, because you have various species that in fact will interbreed. Lions and tigers, for example, horses and donkeys. But by and large, interbreeding is your most common defining characteristic. And no one has created a breed of animal that is unable to produce offspring with the parent population that it comes from. So you can think, well, okay, we have a Chihuahua and a Great Dane. It's hard to see them mating. And yet, if you were to bring the ovum of a Great Dane in contact with the sperm of a Chihuahua, you would produce a dog. You wouldn't find that they were incompatible. Now we realize that this has to do with the number of genes, with the DNA, et cetera, et cetera. But what was somewhat surprising was that animals in the wild tended to look very much like one another if they belonged to the same species. Whereas deliberately bred animals looked very different from one another. So just as a Chihuahua looks different from a Great Dane. So as people thought about people, this became something of a conundrum. Are humans a species? And if they are a species, can all humans interbreed with one another? And in fact, does that matter? Supposing they can, maybe it's like the lion and the tiger, and that they're different species, but they do interbreed. And then you say, well, but when we look at a cross-section of humans, we find that they look very different from one another. But do they look different from one another after the fashion of Chihuahuas and Great Danes, or after the fashion of, say, wolverines and foxes? Is the difference a species difference, or is it a difference of breed? And if it's a difference of breed, how could you understand that? One of the things that occurred to people, certainly by the time of Darwin, was that if you could breed animals for characteristics, you could breed humans for characteristics. And you could say, well, supposing we want to have monstrously fat humans, if we get a monstrously fat mother and mate her with a monstrously fat father, we'll get a really, really chubby baby. Why you would want to do that is unclear, because you don't have a market incentive. There's no big market for really fat babies. On the other hand, there might be a market for extremely tall people in an era of basketball playing. And of course, this is what has been suggested for the People's Republic of China, that they have engaged in breeding experiments to try and produce exceptionally tall people. This practice is generally known as eugenics. Basically, L is Greek for good, and so it's good genes, essentially. And that word was coined by Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton. He advocated that there should be a general sort of societal effort to breed better people. It never became instrumentalized on a large scale, although there appear to have been efforts in Nazi Germany to do this. There were some experiments, or at least thoughts in the United States. There was even a movie that came out devoted to the eugenic thinking. I have never seen the movie. I have not found anyone who ever has seen the movie, but it was called The Black Swan. And if anyone ever has access to it, I would like to find out. Because my grandfather bought the syndication, not syndication, but the publicity rights to The Black Swan back in 1909 or something like that. So I always grew up, and in the basement we had a big poster for The Black Swan. I had no idea what it was, but it's the one movie that was made about eugenics in America.
Justice Holmes' famous remark, 3 generations of idiots is enough, upholding a eugenics statute in, I guess, about 1910.
Yeah, and this became a serious issue. What do you do about people who are poor examples of humanity, who insist on breeding? Darwin talked about this. Spencer talked about this. Galton talked about this. This was a very big issue, and in fact, it goes back to Malthus as well. Here you had people from the most successful and prosperous strata of society saying, wouldn't it be good if people who have inferior characteristics stopped breeding? The flip side of that was, is there, when you recognize, and some of them were very explicit, I think it was Darwin, it may have been Galton, who said that no property owner would allow an inferior dog to breed, or an inferior horse. You simply would castrate them or prevent them from breeding, because everyone who actually interacted with animals in the 19th century knew a lot about breeding, and they simply wouldn't permit it for inferior animals. And so they said, well, why would we permit it for inferior humans? The response to that you got from people like Darwin, or that intellectual set, was that it would be wrong because they're humans. But what should we do then about inferior humans? They said, well, we should have welfare. And we should recognize a social commitment to ensuring that people of limited genetic background are not left by the wayside by society. And they said that this grows out of humane concerns that are, it's an important point, humane concerns that are in themselves a product of evolution. So that humane concerns of humans for other humans would be distinguished in this respect, perhaps to some degree, from humane concerns of humans for animals. So you get a problem in here that this is when the Humane Society and various movements for protection of animals and so forth are gaining clienteles in a very mixed response to this. Some people say, you should relieve the suffering of the poor, but that doesn't mean that you should not put down animals that are unproductive or defective, or use them for experiment. The humane movement splits at the end of the 19th century over the issue of vivisection, because many people who favored humane treatment of animals made an exception for scientific research. They said, well, you should not cause needless harm or injury or pain to animals unless you're doing so in the name of research. And if you cut up an animal while it's still alive, you really find out an awful lot more than if you wait for it to be dead before you cut it up. So vivisection, the upper crust tended to go with the vivisectionists because they thought that was scientific research, whereas people of a more middling social background felt that this was inhumane. And you have the Anti-Vivisection Society splits from the Royal Humane Society, and all this has mirrors in this area of humans. So go back to Spencer. Spencer believed that humans were becoming better and better. This is a very important creed in the 19th century, held by different people on very different conjectures. For Hegel, it was purely a spiritual thing. For Marx, it was a class struggle dialectic that was producing better and better society, not necessarily better and better people. For Spencer, it was that people were becoming better because as they acquired more knowledge, they passed it on genetically to their offspring, and that literally each generation could expect to be superior to the preceding generation. He made a distinction between what he called militant society and industrial society. And he said that, and it's analogous, but somewhat different from Marx's distinction between feudal society and bourgeois society. Militant society, according to Spencer, was a society in which people used force to own or dominate other people. And that in the course of time, they naturally rose above that because as they evolved, they realized that there was something more humane. So that militant society was destined to pass away and to be replaced by something vastly better, which he called industrial society. Obviously not seeing industrial society in quite Marxist terms. And he felt that in industrial society, what you would have would be everyone being rewarded for their efforts through the system of market ownership of production and goods and so on. And that this would reach a point where the state would wither away. In other words, he was a pure capitalist in the sense that capitalism and the market would not only create an equitable society, equitable with understanding that some people are, more capable of achievement than others, but he also believed that you could do away then with government. So that now Herbert Spencer is being revived. His reputation that had been shattered by Richard Hofstadter in 1944 is being restored by the Libertarian philosophy in the United States.
You mean now today?
Now today, yes. You look at libertarians and they say, well, one of the great pioneers of libertarian thought was Herbert Spencer, because he said that the government has no intrinsic role in industrial society. The government was important for militant society, but in industrial society, the market provides everything you need. And that other than defense, you really don't have to have a government. So he said, there's no reason for a government to provide roads or railroads. There's no need for a government to provide education. There's no need for a government to provide welfare. He praised welfare, and he said that the haves, by being more elevated people, will want to give to support the have-nots. So he thought that through private philanthropies, churches or otherwise, the problem of caring for the needy in a society would be taken care of without any government intervention. So from a libertarian point of view, because these are right in line with, kind of, Class A, Ayn Rand thinking about government and society, Spencer is right there at the origin. So now it's important from a libertarian perspective, since libertarians are making a move politically, to try and resurrect Spencer. And that means attacking Richard Hofstadter, because he's the person who vilified Spencer. Poor Spencer, who never had any idea all this was going to go on. And who doesn't seem to have been a particularly genial person anyway. So now, when you look at libertarian efforts to rescue Spencer from oblivion, you find first they will point out that his philosophy was incredibly popular, that he sold 1 million copies. And Hofstadter did not sell 1 million copies of all of his books put together. So he was incredibly popular. People in the late 19th century thought his notion of human progress as being a sort of ineluctable product of the actual movement from generation to generation of the human species, which he called evolution, but not in a Darwinian sense, but rather in a Lamarckian sense, that we get better and better because better children stand on the shoulders of better parents due to the inheritance of their superior characteristics from their parents. So now you'll find that in the libertarian writings that it's pointed out that Richard Hofstadter was a member of the Communist Party, and that he was on record numerous times of saying, "I hate capitalism." So now some people are looking on social Darwinism as maybe social Darwinism was a sort of nasty label for practices that the communists didn't like, namely capitalist practices. And so you have people going back and trying to revisit the late 19th century and say that Spencer was innocent, that he was simply a proto-libertarian. Social Darwinism did not exist under that name, and that the separate sins of the social Darwinists, for example, the Eugenics philosophy, never really grabbed on anyone, and that what social Darwinism maintained was that human difference is wrong. Social Darwinism is in the traditional construction, the post-Hofstadter construction, it's a failed error-ridden philosophy in which the natural equality of humans is being subverted by the idea that humans evolve in unequal fashion. And so now, in this conservative rethinking, you'll have people going back and saying, well, maybe human inequality should not be, should not be assumed to be a bad thing. This may be reminiscent of things just in recent weeks, where the issue of human inequality has been politicized in this country. But it's quite broad. Now, of course, all of this took place at a time when no one had the slightest idea of what genetics were. No one had the slightest idea of what actually happened in inheritance. And the theories of the late 19th century are often based on extraordinarily flawed and incomplete and weak assumptions about about the natural world, about humans and animals and plants. And yet those philosophies are still around, and they still play a role. People still feel that the 19th century was a great cauldron of brilliant new thinking, and the deconstruction of that, I think, is beginning to be underway, perhaps with Michel Foucault as a pioneer in that, and saying that the scientizing of things on sort of pseudoscience of sexuality or mental deviance or things like that, inborn criminality and so on, that kind of pseudoscientific description of inequality was a perversion of the Enlightenment rather than a great accomplishment of the Enlightenment. But then you had something that was going on in a different direction. And it had to do with quantification. Because one of the great divisions that arises in the late 19th century is a division between the idea that you can determine things through quantifying them, that you can actually measure difference in a quantitative fashion, versus the idea that there are certain things that cannot be measured in a quantifiable fashion. For religious people, this had to do with things regarding the soul, or divine activity. But there were many other people who felt that the things that happened in the mind were not susceptible of a quantitative measure. This is why something like Columbia's commitment to a mind, brain, and behavior future to try and put Columbia in the cutting edge of scientific thought is actually a commitment to the idea that quantification and scientific study is adequate to understand all of these things. But in the late 19th century, this was a big division. So you had the birth of sociology at this time. Sociology divides into two camps that, going into the 20th century, and particularly by the middle 20th century, become quite strongly opposing camps. You have one camp that believes in quantification, and that increasingly says that polls and similar measurements of human behavior and so forth actually tell you what the human behavior is. They tell you something. I remember years ago when I first started teaching CC, I was struck by the fact that most of the thinkers in the second half of the course would never get tenure today because none of them were quantifiers. They were having theories about society, humanity, and so forth, but they didn't substantiate them in a quantifiable method. So I thought, well, we should add a text that will be a pioneer work in applying quantification, not simply to the economy, which had already been done, but to social issues. So I signed Emil Durkheim's book on suicide, which is full of graphs about the rates of suicide in France for different times, different places, different categories. And the category that he selects as being a crucial variable is whether you're Protestant or Catholic. Do Protestants commit suicide more often than Catholics? Because, why? Because if they can't confess and get absolution, they're eaten up with guilt. And being eaten up with guilt, they commit suicide. Presumably, Jews commit suicide even more because they're always talking about guilt. I don't know. But it was an example of how quantification, and all my students could see it, how quantification is kind of garbage in, garbage out if it's based upon assumptions that are a priori and not necessarily demonstrable. So that when did quantification become really crucial? In some areas, it's quite early, particularly in those relating to psychological behavior of animals. So that the idea of reflexes, where you ring a bell and the dog salivates because it has been, you've created a reflex through exposure. And you have that area of experimental psychology dealing with animals primarily. That leads to the idea that you actually can not only predict behaviors and measure behaviors, but you can instill behaviors through this sort of process, leading up to, theories, say back in the 60s, like the Skinner box, where you would raise an infant in a box, deprived of all human contact, and then you would supply all of the contacts under experimental fashion, and you would, end up with the child that you wanted to have rather than the one that you were stuck with. This was B.F. Skinner, who was the thinker on this. Wrote a book called Walden 2, a novel about how perfect society would be if everyone was brought up in a completely regimented, parentless society. Had the idea that you could have guided bombs during World War II, where you would simply have you'd have a bomb that would be launched from an airplane, but in order to guide it, in the front of the bomb, you'd have pigeons, and the pigeons would correct the direction of the bomb as it veered according to a compass or an altimeter by pecking colors as they come up. Too low, peck the red, and then of course it'd be rewarded with a bit of corn or something. But this idea of conditioned reflex, leads into experimental psychology. The idea of a social psychology where you could determine things by polling was initially very, very suspect. and the quantifiers were at odds with the more qualitative theorizers in the sociological profession throughout the early 20th century. It remains a huge split in this country. You know, do polls that are followed minutely by by politicians actually tell you something, or do they reflect biases that are built into the questioning that produce answers that are desired on the part of the poller? And of course there are efforts to control all this. But on the other hand, you had people who argued very strongly against the idea of quantification and said that when it comes to the human spirit, to the things that make people who they are, you cannot really quantify it. At this, right now, for example, history departments still believe that humans actually make some difference in what they think and feel, whereas economics and political science departments are more inclined to think that everything can be reduced to quantifiable variables. In my field of Middle East studies, we went through a huge debate on this back in the 80s and 90s over whether culture makes any difference whatsoever. And in the political science profession, which turned against culture, there was a widely held conclusion that culture is not a significant variable, that a peasant in Indonesia will behave quantitatively in the same way as a peasant in Brazil or a peasant in North Korea, given the same stimuli or the same inputs. And therefore there was no need for people to learn obscure languages or religions or cultures and so forth. All they had to do was to run the numbers. This kind of came to an end around 1991 or so. And the person most associated with bringing culture back in was Samuel Huntington, who wrote Clash of Civilizations, which led increasingly to the idea that religion really matters, and that quantitative variables like unemployment rates or education levels or budget allocations for this, that, or the other are important, but they're all conditioned by the religious culture of different peoples. So this debate, the reason I'm going into this is that this debate over human difference has been going on now for a long time. You start back in 1800 or so, and before, when it's assumed humans are different in the same way that it's assumed animals are different. You can classify them, you can describe the differences. You don't have to account for the differences. You can say, that person's a yellow person, that one's a red person, that one's a black person. And the yellows always miss layups in basketball, and the blacks always dunk the ball, and the reds don't play the game at all. I mean, it's, those things were considered simply descriptive because that was how the natural world was dealt with, particularly the organic world at that time. And it really is in the late 19th century that you had, as you had more and more discussion of inheritance and the question of why. See, if people hadn't perceived that there was progress in Europe, they might not have tried to theorize about why progress occurred. So it was not really the 18th century or the early 19th century, but in this later period where the Europeans increasingly felt that they were just a hell of a lot better than everyone else in the world. That the issue of progress and the issue of the reasons for it, particularly as they would pertain to particular social groups or ethnic groups, became more and more an issue. And when you had someone who would come up with a theory of a natural evolution from lesser to better that was directly related to the transition from toward an industrial society, which was the fundamental law, and he called it a law, that Spencer was selling. Along with it, the idea that the rich don't really need to care much about the poor unless they happen to have some spare change. This was incredibly popular. So Spencer is a very good representative of his time. In many ways, a better representative of his time than Darwin is. Because Darwin's discussion ultimately dealt with species. And human difference was increasingly thought not to be a species difference, but rather to be breed differences. Differences between Chihuahuas and Great Danes, rather than differences between foxes and wolverines. And what Darwin did, and Wallace, was to say, we can see over very long term how species came into being. And that ultimately wasn't very interesting except for creationists who were very upset by the implied undermining of divine creation and a short chronology for the existence of the earth. But for people who were not immersed in that particular religious debate, what Darwin had to say was of limited applicability. Because people really weren't that interested in species. They were interested in his descent of man, that did humans evolve from primates? And that was certainly an interest. But the broad notion of species was less engaging than the immediate perception that everybody had of the difference of breeds. So when it comes over, social Darwinism, in a sense, is not Darwinism at all, because the competition is not the competition between the fox and the wolverine, it's the competition between sheepdogs. Or maybe a sheepdog on the one hand and a hunting dog on the other hand. It's a competition between breeds, and the survival of the fittest means the survival of the one that produces the most utility. So this late 19th century engagement with human difference, which I point out is well after the abolition movement has achieved its main achievements. This is not the issue of slavery. This is the issue of human difference, as was increasingly apparent in imperialism as it became more and more intensely engaged in other parts of the world. And interestingly, I'll just finish this, one of the most clearest manifestations of this sort of new notion of human difference was the decision in many, many parts of the colonized world that people should dress like Europeans, because that is what elevated people did. So you can have imperialism in the 18th century in India. India's not dressing like Europeans. Early 19th century in India, India's not going to dress like Europeans. But you get down to 1900 or so, and we can be superior if we look like them, which almost is at the level of dog breeds, because one of the hallmarks of dog and cat breeding was to create an appearance that would be like the most excellent specimens. So you see interesting illustrations where you'll have, for example, the end of the Sino-Japanese War, the 1890s. You have the Japanese delegation is all in Western military costumes, whereas the Chinese delegation is wearing, caps and, felt shoes and robes and so forth. And you go 20 years later, and the Chinese officials are all dressing like Europeans. And you get it almost everywhere. And I think that it has to do with these evolving notions of how to explain or how to deal with human difference. And we still haven't solved these things. But I think we'd be further along if we could simply erase the second half of the 19th century, which saw such an immense flurry of really dumb ideas.